Kill me, or be my husband. The words hung in the frozen air like a blade you couldn't see, only feel. Dawn hadn't broken yet. Not really. Just a pale wash of light over winter-brown plains, enough to catch frost on fence posts, enough to turn cattle breath into drifting ghosts, enough for Caleb Hart to see a figure crossing his land. She didn't run. She came the way someone walks to the end of a sentence, slow, determined, refusing to collapse until the last step is taken. Caleb's hand stayed on the fence rail. Cold wood. This ranch was built on things that didn't change. Work, weather, silence. As she drew closer, two impossible facts sharpened into one reality. She was a woman, and she wore red. Not the warm red of a saloon dress, not the playful red of a ribbon on a girl's wrist. This was blood-red silk, a Chinese qipao cut close to the body, meant for lantern light and crowded streets, not open prairie and frost. The hem was torn, mud stained the side, but she wore it like armor, spine straight, chin lifted, eyes dark and burning. Caleb didn't move. He simply watched, the way he watched a storm decide whether it would pass or hit. The crunch of her boots on frozen earth was the only sound. When she stopped a few feet from him, her breath mingled with his, plumes meeting and disappearing. Up close, she looked older than her face should allow. Not age, wear. A pallor under the cheekbones, lips cracked by wind, a faint bruise along the inside of her wrist, half hidden by the silk cuff. Her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides, knuckles pale, like she was holding herself together through sheer force. Caleb had seen that look before, in cornered animals. Fight and die becoming the same decision. He said nothing. He was a man trained by solitude, by long winters and quiet losses, by a code that stayed simple because anything complicated would break you. Do no harm. Tend what is yours. Expect nothing. She met his silence with her own, then spoke again, voice low and clear. "Kill me," she said. Caleb's eyes narrowed. "And the other part?" His voice came rough, unused, like it had to scrape past something buried. "Or be my husband." No tears, no trembling plea, just an ultimatum, absolute, clean, so honest it felt obscene. The open sky pressed down as if it wanted to hear his answer. Caleb searched her face for madness, for deception, for the bright shine of a liar. He found neither. What he found was dignity sharpened into defiance, the last possession of someone stripped of everything else. "Why?" he asked. It was the only question that mattered. She didn't look away. "Because a dead woman is free," she said evenly, "and a wife belongs to her husband." The word "belongs" landed heavy. Not romance, not promise. Ownership, brutality, a history he didn't need described to understand. Caleb stared past her to the plains. The land offered no guidance, just distance and cold, and the truth that if he sent her away, he wasn't refusing to choose. He was choosing the slowest version of death. His jaw tightened. Marriage was madness. Killing her was unthinkable. But shelter was something a man could offer without surrendering his soul. Caleb gave a short nod, not toward her, toward the cabin standing stubborn against the immense sky. "Inside," he said. For a moment her eyes softened, not with relief, with calculation, as if she needed to be sure this wasn't another trap dressed as mercy. Then she stepped forward, one slow step, then another, and the red silk moved against her legs with a soft whisper, too delicate for this world, too bold to hide. Caleb held the door open. He didn't touch her, didn't guide her. He just watched her pass, and felt, with a quiet certainty, that the ugliness he'd tried to outrun had finally reached his porch. Behind them, the wind kept moving, as if nothing had changed. But Caleb knew better, because on his land, a woman in red had just demanded a choice, and neither answer would come without blood. The cabin was warm, not the soft warmth of comfort, the practical warmth of survival. Wood smoke drifted slowly through the room. The fire in the stone hearth crackled low, throwing restless light across rough walls. A small table, 2 chairs, and the narrow bed built against the far wall. It was the home of a man who needed very little. Caleb closed the door behind her. The wind disappeared instantly, leaving only the quiet sound of burning wood. The woman in red stood near the entrance, perfectly still. She didn't wander, didn't sit, didn't touch anything. Her eyes moved across the room carefully, measuring distances, doors, shadows, like someone who had learned that a room could turn into a trap without warning. Caleb crossed to the table. He poured water from a kettle into a tin cup, then slid it across the wood. "Drink," he said. She didn't reach for it, not at first. Caleb leaned against the wall, arms folded loosely. He didn't watch her directly, but he noticed the way her fingers twitched at her sides, the small tremor running through them. Not weakness, exhaustion finally catching up. Slowly she stepped forward, each step careful, deliberate, as if the floor itself might betray her. When she finally lifted the cup, her hands trembled slightly. She drank in small, controlled sips, not greedily, like someone trained to make every movement polite, invisible. Caleb pushed a bowl across the table. Leftover stew, bread hardened by the cold. Simple food. She stared at it, then at him. "For me?" she asked quietly. Caleb nodded once. She sat slowly. The red silk of her dress rustled softly as she moved. The color was wrong here, too alive against the dull browns and grays of the cabin. She ate carefully at first, one bite, then another. Then the rhythm changed. The spoon moved faster, then faster, like someone unsure if the food would vanish if she paused too long. Caleb looked away, pretended to watch the fire. After several minutes, she slowed again, forcing the same careful manners back into place. The effort alone told him how long she'd lived in fear. Silence filled the cabin. Not uncomfortable, just cautious. Finally, she set the spoon down. Her dark eyes lifted to meet his. "You ask my name?" she said softly. Caleb shrugged slightly. "You'll tell it when you're ready." She considered that answer. It seemed to surprise her. "Lin Mei," she said at last. The name sat in the air for a moment. Caleb nodded. "Caleb Hart." She repeated it slowly. "Caleb." Outside, the wind pressed against the walls again, a long, lonely sound across the plains. May's shoulders stiffened slightly. Her eyes drifted toward the window, always listening, always waiting. Caleb noticed. "Nothing out there," he said. She didn't answer, but her breathing eased a little. Caleb crossed the room and placed a folded blanket near the hearth, along with a pillow made from a grain sack. "You can sleep there." May looked at the blanket, then at the bed across the room, then back at him. "Where do you sleep?" she asked. Caleb pulled the wooden chair closer to the fire. "Here." Her brow tightened slightly. "You are my husband now?" she asked. Caleb's expression didn't change. "No." The word landed firm. "Not tonight," he added quietly. For the first time since arriving, something in her face softened. Not trust, but relief. She knelt beside the fire and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. The red dress glowed in the lantern light, like a coal refusing to go dark. Caleb studied the bruise on her wrist again. The shape looked familiar, the kind left by rope. "Who were you running from?" he asked. May stared into the fire. The flames reflected in her eyes. "Men who think a woman can be bought," she said quietly. Caleb didn't reply. He didn't need the rest of the story. The fire burned lower. The wind outside grew colder. Eventually, May lay down beside the hearth, the blanket pulled tight around her, but her eyes stayed open. Caleb sat in the chair, rifle resting across his knees, watching the door, watching the dark. Hours passed. Just before sleep finally claimed her, May spoke softly, almost too soft to hear. "You chose the harder answer today," she said. Caleb stared into the fire. "Did I?" he murmured. Outside, the plains stretched empty beneath the frozen sky. But somewhere beyond that darkness, someone would already be looking for the woman in red. And Caleb Hart had just made himself part of that search. Morning came slowly to the ranch. The frost on the fields caught the first pale light of the sun, turning the plains silver for a moment before the cold wind brushed it away. Caleb was already outside, splitting wood. The steady crack of the axe echoed across the empty land. Work had always been the simplest way to keep a man's thoughts quiet. Behind him, the cabin door opened softly. May stepped onto the porch. She had washed her face, tied her hair back with a thin strip of red silk torn from the inside lining of her dress. The chipao had been carefully mended during the night, not perfectly, but with patient, precise stitches. Caleb noticed. He didn't stop chopping, but he noticed. May watched him for a long moment. The rhythm of the axe, the quiet discipline of a man who lived alone. "You work early," she said. Caleb drove the axe into another log. "Winter doesn't wait." She nodded slowly, then stepped down from the porch. The chickens scattered when she approached the coop. She crouched slowly, murmuring something soft in Mandarin. The birds quieted. Caleb paused mid-swing, watching. "You speak to chickens now?" he asked. May gave a faint smile. "They listen better than most men." For a moment, Caleb almost smiled back. Almost. By midday, the sky had turned gray again, clouds rolling low across the plains, the kind that promised snow. May carried a small bucket of eggs toward the cabin. Her steps were steadier now. The exhaustion that had clung to her yesterday had eased, replaced by quiet awareness. Caleb sat on the porch steps sharpening a knife. The metal slid slowly across the stone. May stopped beside him. Her gaze fell on the long scar across his forearm. Old, deep. "You were a soldier," she said. Caleb didn't look up. "No." She waited. "A cattle drive went wrong once," he added. The explanation ended there. May understood the silence that followed. Some wounds were not stories. She set the bucket down, then lifted her sleeve slightly. The bruise on her wrist had darkened overnight. The shape of rope burns was clearer now. Caleb's jaw tightened. "You were tied," he said. May nodded once. "The merchant who bought me died last winter," she said calmly. "His debts were sold." The words sounded simple, but their weight filled the porch. "I was part of the debt," she continued. Caleb finally looked at her. "They were sending me to the railroad camps in the mountains." The wind moved through the dry grass. "I ran," she finished. Silence settled again, the heavy kind that doesn't ask for comfort. Caleb slid the knife back into its sheath. "Railroad camps," he said quietly. He knew enough about those places, men who had been alone too long, money changing hands, things no decent person would describe. May sat beside him on the porch. The red silk of her dress moved softly in the wind. "You did not ask for this trouble," she said. Caleb looked across the endless plains. "This land always brings trouble," he said. May studied his face carefully. "You could still send me away." Caleb didn't answer. Instead, he stood and walked to the fence line. The land stretched for miles in every direction, empty, exposed. After a moment, he spoke. "Anyone chasing you?" May hesitated. "Yes." "How far behind?" "I do not know." Caleb nodded slowly. The answer was honest. May watched him. "You regret opening the door?" she asked. Caleb leaned against the fence. The wind tugged at his coat. "Ask me that when they arrive." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then May said something unexpected. "If they come, I will not let you die for me." Caleb gave a low breath that might have been a laugh. "You're assuming I'd lose." May tilted her head slightly. "You are only one man." Caleb looked back at the cabin, the smoke rising from the chimney, the red figure standing beside his porch. "One man is usually enough," he said quietly. The wind carried the sound of distant hooves, or maybe it was only the wind. Neither of them moved, but both of them listened. The sound came again, faint at first, like the wind knocking loose stones together. Then clearer. Hooves. May heard it the same moment Caleb did. Her shoulders stiffened, her hands slowly tightened against the wood of the porch rail. Caleb didn't move right away. He just listened, measuring distance the way a rancher measures storms. 2 riders, maybe 3, still far. He stepped down from the porch and walked toward the fence line. The rifle leaned against the post where he'd left it earlier. He picked it up without hurry. May followed him with her eyes. "Is it them?" she asked quietly. Caleb shrugged. "Someone." That was answer enough. The riders appeared over the low rise a few minutes later. 2 men, city coats, dark horses, the posture of men who believed land and people could both be owned. One of them rode ahead of the other. You could see it in the way the second man watched him, waiting for instruction. The lead rider slowed his horse as he reached the fence. His coat was too fine for ranch work, his smile too practiced. "Afternoon, rancher," he called. Caleb rested the rifle across the fence, not pointing it, just letting it be seen. "What do you want?" The rider's eyes moved past him, toward the cabin, toward the woman in red standing on the porch. "There she is," he said softly. The second rider laughed. "Told you she wouldn't get far." May didn't move, but Caleb saw the color drain slightly from her face. The lead rider tipped his hat politely. "Name's Finch," he said. "I'm looking for something that belongs to my employer." Caleb's expression didn't change. "You're on my land." Finch smiled wider. "Yes, I noticed." He gestured toward the porch. "That Chinese woman." "She's property." The word landed like a stone dropped in water. Caleb didn't blink. "There's no property here that isn't mine." Finch chuckled softly. "Oh, she's yours now?" He reached slowly into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, held it up. "Bill of sale," he said. "Signed in San Francisco." May's voice came from the porch, quiet, steady. "I am not going back." Finch didn't even look at her. He kept his eyes on Caleb. "I'm prepared to be reasonable," Finch said. $200 for your trouble." The second rider nodded eagerly. "That's good money for a stray." Caleb's hand rested on the rifle, still calm, still loose. "You rode a long way for nothing," he said. Finch's smile faded. "Don't be foolish," he said. "That woman is debt. She was purchased legally." Behind him, the wind shifted. Dust rolled slowly across the plain. Caleb's voice dropped lower. "She's my wife." The words changed the air between them. Finch stared at him, then laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Your wife?" he said. "Well now, That's interesting. He leaned forward slightly in the saddle. The law has another word for that: theft. May stepped off the porch. The red silk of her dress moved like fire against the pale winter land. She walked slowly toward the fence, stopped beside Caleb. Her voice was calm. I married him by choice. Finch studied her for a moment. The calm in her eyes seemed to irritate him. You think marriage changes ownership? He said. It changes everything, Caleb replied. The two men stared at each other across the fence, the kind of stare that usually ended with gunfire. Finch broke it first. He sighed, almost disappointed. You're making this harder than it needs to be. He folded the paper again and tucked it back into his coat. I'll come back, he said quietly. And next time, I'll bring the county sheriff, a man who understands how business works. His horse turned slowly. Before riding away, he glanced back at Caleb. You can't hide from the law forever. Then the riders galloped off, leaving only dust and the fading echo of hooves. The ranch fell silent again. May stood very still beside the fence, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. Caleb lowered the rifle. They'll come back, he said. May nodded slowly. Yes. The wind moved across the plains again. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, fear returned to her eyes. You should let me go, she said softly. Caleb looked at her. No, he said. Because the moment Finch had called her property, the fight had stopped being only hers. Night came early over the plains. The sky darkened into a deep iron gray, and the wind carried the smell of distant snow. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. May sat at the table with her hands folded neatly in front of her, the posture of someone trying to keep control over a storm inside her chest. Caleb stood by the window, watching the dark horizon, watching for riders that were no longer there. After a long while, May spoke. You should have taken the money. Caleb didn't turn. It wasn't enough. A faint breath escaped her. That was not what I meant. Silence filled the room again, the kind of silence that grows heavier the longer it stays. You can still tell them I ran away, May said quietly. They will believe you. Caleb finally turned from the window. His face was calm, but the decision in his eyes had already been made. You think men like Finch stop looking just because they get their money back? May lowered her gaze. No. They come back, Caleb continued, for pride, if not profit. The fire cracked softly in the hearth. May's voice became smaller. This was never your fight. Caleb walked to the table and stood across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said quietly, You walked across my land and gave me two choices: kill you or marry you. May's fingers tightened slightly. I chose the third one. She looked up. Which one is that? She asked. Caleb's voice was calm. The one where you stay. The words settled into the room slowly, like snow falling onto open ground. Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin walls. May studied him carefully. "You would fight them?" Caleb shrugged slightly. "I've fought worse things than men with papers." For the first time since Finch had ridden away, something in her expression softened. Not safety, not yet, but the beginning of trust. Days passed. Finch did not return. The plains remained empty. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the land. The snow began to melt, revealing dark earth beneath. One afternoon, May stood beside the cabin studying a small patch of ground. Caleb walked over. "What are you looking at?" "The soil," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "In my village," she continued softly, "spring means planting." She pointed to the small patch beside the cabin. "We could grow something here." Caleb looked at the ground, then at her. The woman who had arrived in red silk and desperation now stood calmly on his land, already thinking about the future. "Vegetables?" he asked. May nodded. "Maybe beans." Caleb gave a slow breath. "That land hasn't been used in years." "Then it is waiting," she replied. For a moment he said nothing. Then he nodded once. "All right." They stood together quietly, watching the late afternoon sun slide across the plains. The ranch was still the same lonely place it had always been. The same fences, the same wind, the same endless sky. But something inside it had changed. Two strangers who had once stood on opposite sides of a desperate choice were now standing on the same piece of ground. Not as owner and property, not as savior and refugee, but as two people who had decided to face the world together. The horizon remained empty, for now. And in the quiet space between danger and peace, they began planting something neither of them had expected to find: a home.